What's up everyone, and thank you for stopping by the channel. Today's project is this very long Stihl pole saw, and the problem is that it hasn't been used in a long time, and of course now it won't start. Let's take a good look at it, find out what's wrong with it, and hopefully we can fix it. In this video, we try and repair this pole saw. However, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. A lot of people consider Stihl equipment to be top of the line, and this would be a perfect example. I normally deal with residential grade tools that are heavy, bulky, and unrefined, so this is very refreshing. So what we know about this pole saw is it's been years since it was last used, and the worst part is it was put up with fuel in the tank, and the pre-mixed fuel has turned into a sticky tar. That means the carburetor is going to be toast, but I still want to try and save it. I want to see how healthy this engine is, so I'm going to use a compression tester. These are very affordable online, or if you can, try borrowing one. Now, I want to see a reading over 50 psi, and the higher the better. If it's under 50, then we may have problems even starting it. Just remove the spark plug and screw in the tester, and then pull the rope a few times. This is going to be a bit tricky because the reading is about 45 psi, which means if it starts, it will be down on power. Now, I still want to try and save this pole saw, so I'll continue troubleshooting it. The next thing I want to do is check that it still runs, especially because the compression is low. I'll put some fuel into the carburetor's throat and try starting it. Well, the good news is that it started and ran for a bit, which is kind of surprising. The next thing I want to check is exactly how the engine is worn. To do that, I'm going to remove the muffler and look at the piston and rings and see if they're just worn out or if the damage is worse than that. For those who are curious, the spark arrestor screen is clear, so it's not restricting any airflow on the engine. So here's the exhaust port on the engine, and if you can't see the piston rings, just turn the flywheel on the front of the engine and move the piston into view. The good news is that the rings, which are the dark bands on the piston, are not scratched or gouged, so the wear seems to be normal and not from serious damage from running straight gas. That means we might have a good chance saving this engine. I'll put the muffler back on and then I'll remove and inspect the carburetor. I'll start by removing the primer bulb section of the carburetor first, and on this particular one, the metering diaphragm is underneath it, and as expected, it's beginning to harden up a bit. It's supposed to be flexible to work the rocker arm underneath it, so we'll definitely need to replace it. You can order a new diaphragm from any large online retailer. After removing it, make sure you take note of how long the stem is in the middle of the diaphragm. The next thing we need to check is the pumping diaphragm. It's under this plate, and I have to say it's not good under there. What I see is something like tar. It's sticky and sweet smelling. This is a bad sign, as it means any small passages might be clogged with it as well. We need to clean it with some carburetor cleaner. The next thing to check is that the small screen is clean, which it is. Now, if yours has debris on it, then the filter is probably off the fuel line in the tank. If that's the case, you may also need to replace the fuel lines. What we have to check for on the pumping diaphragm is that these two small check valve flaps are parallel with the rest of the diaphragm. To do that, look at it from the side. Ours looks okay, so it should work just fine, but if yours aren't, consider replacing the carburetor. Now, before I put the carburetor back together, I want to make sure that fuel will flow through the screen when pressing the rocker arm assembly. And it flowed through it very well, so now I'm going to clean the carburetor, replace the metering diaphragm, and then reassemble it. Now, I know it would be better if I dropped this into an ultrasonic cleaner, but most people don't have one, so I'm going to clean it like most people would. Also, I'm going to replace the primer bulb that was destroyed probably by ethanol gas. These can be found online for just a few dollars. Another reason why your pole saw may not be starting is the fuel. Unless you're into lawn care, most people simply do not use them very often. So the time between uses can be very long, and if there's still fuel in the tank, it will be bad. Make sure you empty the tank after you use it and run it dry. When reconnecting the fuel lines, make sure the line with the filter goes on the bottom port and the return line goes to the top port. I'm not going to connect the return line just yet until I make sure the primer is actually working to draw fuel from the tank. I'm going to be honest, I didn't have a good feeling about this working at all because I had to press the primer bulb a lot. In fact, I lost count. Also, the color of the fuel that does eventually enter the primer bulb is the same as that tar that was inside the carburetor. Though it is drawing fuel, so hopefully it's cleaning itself out. I'll also reconnect the return line on the top port. I'm going to save you a lot of time and tell you what just happened. It didn't start, and even after manually priming it, it still didn't run. The spark plug isn't getting wet, so the carburetor isn't working, probably because it's clogged. Even after turning out the H and the L screw to deliver more fuel, didn't make any changes. The only thing left to do is to replace the carburetor. I wasn't going to pay for an OEM replacement part, so I went to an online retailer and searched for a carburetor for this model. It was about $10 and came with some gaskets too. Before I install it, I'm going to compare the two to make sure that they are the exact same, which in this case they are. Make sure that you install the gasket between the carburetor and the engine, otherwise the engine may not start. After installing the fuel lines, press the primer bulb a few times and make sure that it's working like it's supposed to. Now, if yours doesn't work, make sure you have enough fuel in the tank. Now the carburetor comes set with a default setting from the factory, so a slight adjustment is sometimes needed. I turned out the L screw a bit so it revs up a little bit faster. Before the adjustment, there was a slight delay when squeezing the throttle and the engine revving up. I also turned the H screw out for a bit more fuel so that it runs a bit rich to keep the engine temperatures down, otherwise you can burn up the engine. Now I always try and save the original carburetor if I can, but this one was not savable. Now I could have taken it apart one more time and tried soaking the carb in cleaner overnight, but there would have been a chance that it still wouldn't work. But replacing the carburetor has a very high chance of working, so it's always a safe bet. So my question is, would you have tried to clean the carburetor again, or would you have just replaced it instead, like I had to? Is it worth saving $10? Now I know how I feel about it, but I'm more curious about your answer. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate your time. Please feel free to ask any questions, and I hope to see you in my next video.